Yes.
Yes? Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Rogério Mauricio. I am from Brazil, and I am a GASL member and coordinator of the Close Deficiency Gap Action Network, which is in charge of this seminar. First of all, I'd like to thank GASL, Shirley, Eduardo, and Lavinia, and all the participants, 239 registrations, for this incredible opportunity to discuss resilience in livestock sector. Before starting, I would like to make some clarifications of the rules. We recommend all the participants kindly send your questions direct to a specific speaker using the option button Q&A. The questions not answered during the seminar are going to be answered afterwards. The chat option will receive only comments. Thank you for your attention. As an introduction, the COVID-19 pandemic seminar held by GASL last September demonstrates that livestock has a significant capacity for resilience in times of crisis. This webinar aims to initiate the discussion of resilience within Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, focusing on the relationship between animal health, animal production, livelihoods, climate change, and COVID-19. Based on the importance of addressing resilience in the livestock sector, especially during challenging times, the Action Network, Close Deficiency Gap, is happy to organize this discussion within the GASL community to identify the main parameters and common approach to the topic of resilience in the livestock, with special focus on ruminants. Now, it's my pleasure to invite Shirley Tarawali, the chair of the GASL, for a few words. Shirley, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rogério, and good day to all of you in whatever time zone you might happen to be. As you've heard from Rogério, I'm Shirley Tarawali. I'm chair of the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, or GASL, as we often say, and I'm Assistant Director General at ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya, and that's where I'm speaking to you from now. Let me just set this webinar in the context first of the Global Agenda, or GASL, and secondly, touch on, and Rogério already did this, the issues of resilience. The Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock is a multi-stakeholder partnership with 115 members and numerous, over 1,000 stakeholders. And these cover every dimension of the livestock sector, from the smallest backyard, one-cow operation, pastoral and range-based systems, through emerging new businesses, to large-scale commercial enterprises. Producers, processors, covering every region of the world, and including every type of stakeholder, governments, private sector, NGOs, research, investors, civil society, and multilateral organizations. And by providing opportunities to add together these very different perspectives, through assembling evidence, developing actions to foster practice and policy change, and supporting dialogue, GASL aims to make livestock systems more sustainable and to enhance the sector's development contributions. And one of the main ways, the primary ways that GASL works, is through a series of technical networks focused on topical and sometimes indeed controversial issues. And one of these is the Closing the Efficiency Gap, which is convening today's webinar under the leadership of Rogério. So why focus on resilience? I guess, as Rogério said, we hardly need to ask that question these days, when across the world, the COVID pandemic has exposed the vulnerability, the fragility of our food systems, and caused everyone to begin referring to resilient food systems, building forward resilient food systems. But of course, this is rather a complex issue, Resilience itself has many dimensions, trade-offs, and is understood very differently in different contexts. So today's webinar helps us to unpack what this means across the livestock sector. We're really pleased and privileged to have Dr. Jennifer Hodbod from Michigan State, who's a board member of the Resilience Alliance, and she'll give us a keynote with a broad overview of the issue. And then we'll delve into some real case studies from around the world that illustrate resilience in real life, as well as illustrating the diversity of both challenges and opportunities. Many thanks, Rogerio, for taking the initiative to organize this topical and important webinar, to all our speakers for generously preparing and sharing with us today, and for all of you that joined online. We look forward to a rich and fruitful time together. Many thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Shirley, for your kind words. And it's our pleasure to continue this seminar. So it's my pleasure to invite Jane Hodbod, who is assistant professor in the Department of Community Sustainability and a board member of the Resilience Alliance. She is an environmental social scientist and uses one interdisciplinary approach to research the resilience of a food system. Jenny, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rogerio. I'm going to share my screen. So we're going to do the age-old check of, can everybody see that? I'm hoping someone will tell me if you can't.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm thrilled to talk to you all today about resilience assessment, particularly in the livestock sector. As has been introduced, I'm faculty at Michigan State University in the Department of Community Sustainability, and I've been involved with the Resilience Alliance since I was a PhD student, and I'm now on the board. And today I'm going to give an overview of kind of what Shirley mentioned, actually, some of those different understandings of resilience, what we how we interpret resilience within the RA and from a social ecological resilience perspective, and then how I apply that within resilience assessment in livestock systems. So whenever I'm teaching my students or about resilience, I always start with a definition, and I'm afraid it's a long and wordy one, but we're going to break it down, don't worry. So from my perspective, social ecological resilience is the capacity of a system to respond to change through adaptation or transformation while maintaining structure, function, and identity, and to support positive and proactive change. Some kind of pieces of that I'm going to talk about first. I'm going to come back to the capacity of a system piece, but generally what multiple perspectives on resilience have in common is that we're looking at ways that individuals, organizations, systems respond to change. And often what we're looking at is, can you respond to change and maintain something in the system that you find desirable or important? From an RA perspective, we break that down to talk about structure and function of systems. And this is kind of building on 50 years of research now. So this is just a quick kind of timeline, but one of the seminal papers from a social ecological resilience perspective was Buzz Holling's paper in 1973, which created this interest from ecologists, but also from ecological economists who began engaging with these ideas a couple of decades later in the 1990s. And the Resilience Alliance was a group of interdisciplinary group who formed in 1997 and then spent the next kind of 10 years really publishing a lot about the theory of social ecological systems and resilience within them, which led to a change from the discussion previously often coming from engineering about resilience as a rate of return. So how long does it take for something to recover post a disturbance or bounce back, to more of a conversation about resilience as a system property. So this is different in that it shows that systems are dynamic and capable of self-organization. There are different identities or regimes that we talk about, and multiple kind of potential identities. And understanding a system's perspective lets us kind of unpack those dynamics and what's creating the current regime. Because this came primarily from ecology, kind of up till this point, in the 2000s, social scientists and economists, kind of pure economists, began to engage with these ideas. And there were lots of really great discussions about how people were potentially being treated as kind of homogenous groups when really we're all kind of, there's quite a lot of diversity, and there's power dynamics that influence how people can be resilient, and how are we to use these ideas or operationalize them. So that led to some adaptation of definitions, still keeping resilience as a systems property, but understanding that it's experienced differently by different actors in a system. And at that point, we began to see resilience take off in terms of use. And it became commonly, I think as Shirley also kind of alluded to, commonly used in sort of a buzzword sense, interchangeable with sustainability. Resilience is always good. And this doesn't quite align with the theory underlying social ecological resilience. Poverty is a really resilient state. It's very hard to break out of. It's not desirable. And so we want to make sure that when considering these ideas of resilience, we're thinking about them critically. And so I would argue that we want to maintain this understanding about resilience of a system property, and think about how different people or different organizations or such experience it. So to understand that experience piece, a lot of the theory talks about this spectrum of behaviors that support resilience from adaptation to transformation. And these are really kind of the elements of system change that unify these different perspectives on resilience, and have led us to this, rather than bouncing back, talking about bouncing back better, and that resilience is, yes, the capacity to deal with change, but bringing in that piece from the development sciences and studies about how it's also important to use resilience to allow you to continue to develop, which is why I've got this final piece in my definition about supporting positive and proactive change. And through that, we can actually link resilience and sustainability. So what we're aiming for are systems that are both sustainable and resilient, in that they supply the ecosystem services on which we depend in a sustainable way, and that support the resilience of those social ecological systems. How does that happen? Well, I would argue that actually within the kind of adaptation to transformation sphere, there's also coping at the kind of further extreme. So what you see here are 3 different broad categories of actions that support resilience, from really short-term reactive decisions, which I would call coping, through to these long-term kind of proactive choices that come under the transformation category. And essentially a system is resilient if it can use coping, adaptation or transformation to maintain its desired identity. If you have some type of collapse in that identity, then that would indicate a lack of resilience. And to give you some examples from the context that we're interested in, examples of coping might be things like opening up dry season grazing early, changing kind of supplements, or changing, if you're already in a rotational grazing pattern, changing how you're moving through the system. Those are fairly low, they require low levels of resources and not a lot of thinking about. Adaptation requires more effort. It requires more financial resources or time resources or knowledge. And so it might be things like switching from a more continuous grazing to a rotational grazing method as an adaptation, or changing the species or the that you're dealing with in your herd to adapt to kind of different climate conditions, etc. Transformation is kind of opening up a broader category of things that require much more information and planning. So things like stacking enterprises, we could argue, are transformations because they change how you're using the environment. For example, introducing agritourism is going to introduce this new suite of cultural ecosystem services to a farm, or adding different kind of byproducts like leathers that I have here might mean changing who you're interacting with within the market. The kind of extreme of this is potentially not being able to continue farming or ranching where you are presently and having to either migrate to maintain your livelihood, which would be a form of transformation, or stay where you are and change livelihood, which would be a form of transformation. It's transformation in that case because it's autonomous and you have a choice. If, for example, you go bankrupt, then we would argue that's a loss of resilience and it's not a transformation, it's a kind of collapse in resilience instead. So to underlie those types of decisions people are making, we talk about 7 principles for building resilience. I think they kind of boil down to three big ones. The first one is maintaining diversity, because diversity, biodiversity, social diversity, cultural diversity gives you backup plans, it gives you insurance. It also ensures that within your social networks, you have access to new ideas or resources, and those new ideas and resources can help you learn and experiment, which supports adaptation. Because we're taking a systems perspective, we want to make sure that we keep that perspective in our management, and that includes managing for slow variables like soil degradation, for example, not just the things that kind of happen on a daily or weekly, monthly basis. And then we also want to support participation and integrating diverse perspectives, because that again supports that access to information and learning piece. So that's a lot of theory. And what do we actually do with that? How do we operationalize it and use it to assess resilience? Well, we're guided in the RA by the question resilience of what, to what, and for whom. And so the flyer that you might have seen before today had a link to the Resilience Alliance workbooks, which have these 5 different stages. I'm a social scientist. In my work, what I've been trying to do is strengthen the kind of equity dynamics within resilience assessment. And so I've actually condensed these into 3. The top box reflects kind of the resilience of what, how do you conceptualize the system? And then how does the system respond to change refers to kind of the resilience to what and for whom. And I want to be very clear from the beginning that this type of approach doesn't create a quantifiable kind of resilience metric. It's really an in-depth approach to understanding system dynamics and cause and effect within your system. So there's not one explicit toolbox. And what I would argue is it needs to be very context specific, usually based on specific case studies with an interdisciplinary and often participatory approach. And I'm going to give you a bit more context on that today. So some broad questions for understanding the resilience of what, or conceptualizing the system, is to just be really clear about the social ecological system you're interested in, because you need to draw some boundaries. So is it a farm level? Is it a river basin level? Is it a sector? You're going to have to draw some geographic kind of time and governance boundaries, with the caveat that because of the complex systems approach, there'll be influences from systems smaller and larger than yours. So you do need to be aware of those cross-scale dynamics. The second step is to identify the core components, because that's what's going to give you the indicators to keep track of as you do your resilience assessment. So I always start with the social ecological systems model. What is your ecosystem? What are the ecosystem services it provides? Who are they being used by? And what actions are those people or organizations having on the ecosystem in turn? Just as a quick case study, a lot of the work I do is in East Africa. This is a case study in southwest Ethiopia, where we have a dam being built in a traditionally agro-pastoralist river basin with multiple different indigenous groups. And what we've seen is a collapse in flood recession agriculture and changing fodder availability for grazing. And so in this context, we've looked at multiple different scales. We've looked at the river basin as a whole. We've looked at a specific region within Ethiopia, the Lower Omo, and we've looked at smaller scales for individual politico-territorial groups such as the Nyangatom. Going through the social ecological systems approach helps identify kind of the type of ecosystem and what ecosystem services are important, commonly provision of food and water, but also regulating services to do with biodiversity and cultural services to do with sense of place. By understanding the diversity of communities and diversity within communities, which is often identified by herd size, that's important to understand who's accessing those services. But we also want to understand the governance and the fact that because of the dam, we now have these new international actors active in the region. And we want to understand the change in actions, which has been a collapse in flood recession agriculture, changes in grazing habits, increase in collection of wild foods, and increase in irrigated agriculture. The combination of those helps us understand the identity of the system and gives some ideas for indicators, which again, you will all adapt to the relevant context. But in my case, we did participatory mapping to work out which ecosystem services to count. And we also looked at perceptions of food security and wealth within different communities. This is just a quick map to show that that got kind of bundled together with some remote sensing to look at where change in those ecosystem services was happening, which gave us a prompt to then tie in with our food security and wealth analyses. And what the analysis showed was that resilience was decreasing because a change in ecosystem services was actually decreasing those that communities valued and having a knock-on effect for their food security and wealth, which meant they didn't have the same coping strategies they had previously. For the second half, the resilience to what for whom I always look at together, but you do need to decide, are you interested in one specific shock, or is it a pattern of shocks over time? How have your system components then been affected by that shock or shocks? And remember to embed equity here, because we want to understand how that impact is different for different types of actors. We're interested then in the way that they've responded, and is it through coping, adaptation, or transformation? And which principles are kind of underlying those actions of coping, adaptation, or transformation? And if you're intentionally trying to create change, you need to be clear about whose perspectives you're including for this desirable future stage. So again, in our project, we started off interested in the Gibe 3 dam, but actually had to start looking at slow variables as well, because concurrent with that, land degradation and population change are having impacts on ecosystem service availability. We looked at the impact on actions and ecosystem services, and then did a kind of political ecology informed study about who was bearing those costs and who was collecting the benefits. And what happened to be those directing the change from outside of the basin were collecting the benefits, and the costs were being borne by community. And that reflects essentially an intentional transformation happening at the largest kind of governance scale, but communities not having voice within that process to direct the change. And so they are limited to kind of coping and adaptation, which they have demonstrated to a point, but our analysis would suggest they're reaching the limits of their resilience. And if there's a further shock, they may not be able to maintain in the current kind of livelihoods that they have. So we stitch all these things together in system diagrams. These just give you a clue of some of the indicators we've been looking at over time, and then we can run analyses for different groups and how they've each been affected. And that was a whistle-stop tour through what's actually like 5 years of work. But what I want to end on is that these really are in-depth analyses most of the time. If you want kind of quick quantifiable outcome, adaptive capacity is a much easier place to start and will help you understand resilience, but it's not the full kind of overview of dynamics that you'll get from a resilience assessment. So a resilience assessment is this kind of iterative approach that's adapted to your context and informed by discipline from expertise from multiple different disciplines. It's often done in collaboration with partners within the system, because it's intended to be embedded into management as a long-term process. And just because we're not quantifying or measuring something doesn't mean we're not assessing resilience. It's about identifying those key indicators to track over time so that you can understand, given your in-depth knowledge of the dynamics of the system, why the things you're really interested in are changing or not. So that was a quick introduction. I'm happy to take questions, obviously, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
So thank you very much indeed, Jenny, for your wonderful contribution for us, and especially during the description of the timeline, the different examples, and the challenge to measure resilience. Thank you very much indeed, and I hope that you have some questions for you later on. So before the next speaker, now it's time for our poll question, which I would kindly invite you to answer that. So I project the question that I'd like to give your feedbacks, please. So resilience, livestock and resilience. Please mark which stakeholder group you belong to: private sector, public sector, academic research, donors, social movements, intergovernmental and multilateral organization, no governmental organization. And the second one, which is related to the one before, what is the most important outcome of the livestock sector for which resilience could be evaluated? Profitability and income stability, especially at farm level, effective food value chain, livestock health and welfare, healthy rural communities, or long-term ecological sustainability. Please give to us your answer for those two questions, and we present later the results. Thank you. Thank you very much. So hopefully that you finish. I would like to invite our second speaker, Pablo Manzano. He's a postdoctoral researcher of the Helsinki Institute of Sustainability Science, University of Helsinki. He has nearly 20 years experience in research, policy, and practical practice on pastoralism system worldwide. Pablo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rogerio. I am here today to talk about the assessment of resilience in pastoral systems, which is an open line of research that we have at the University of Helsinki, and where I also collaborate at the PAS Center for Climate Change in Bilbao, in Spain. Okay, you are seeing my screen, I guess, but it's not advancing. Okay. So the first reflection on pastoralist systems is that they are very widespread all over the world. There is no comprehensive map on their actual extent, but this is the best information we have so far, which is a map that was created by the World Initiative for Sustainable Pastoralism at IUCN some years ago. But one thing that we can see indeed is that pastoralists are all over the place. They're all over the world, in all emerged lands, and they are both to be found in developed countries and in developing countries, in arid areas, in cold areas, in mountain areas, even in some wet areas, not all of them, but some wet areas. And this is already given us the hint that pastoralist systems are widespread, they're old, and they display a considerable diversity, which is a proof of their resilience. It means that they have been able to survive in the world for 10,000 years, and that they are able to adapt to a lot of environments. When we analyze the fundamental elements for the sustainability and for the resilience, we go on the so-called the three pillars of sustainability that most of you would have heard before. One is the natural resource management, and as we can see, the pastoralists can use a very diverse array of resources that are available both in space and time, and this is why they use a lot of mobility, not only horizontal mobility, but also, as you can see in the picture, vertical mobility that allows to maximize the opportunities given by natural resources. A very important element of their socio-ecological system is also the social relationships that they display, because they actually establish networks and alliances. And when you have worked for some time with rural communities in Africa, you are aware that sometimes pastoralists are considered by some fellow rural groups not to be hardworking because they talk a lot and they don't work on the land so much. But it's because information and relationships is such a big asset. And it also allows them to build solid governance structures that allow them for establishing rules and regulations and for repaying favors when needed. And also they have very obvious elaborate economic strategies, such as the use of specific breeds that can make the most out of the available resources, and also the markets and the strategy to use the markets with a wide variety of products. As you can see here, this is from a cooperative in Mauritania that makes a lot of products out of camel. Now, when we talk about the resilience of pastoral systems and this diverse array of relationships, we can imagine it as a net with nodes that are composed by the natural resources, by the market products, or even by the social components of pastoral society and the rural society that surrounds it. And like linking with the presentation that Jennifer has done, to understand the fundamentals of resilience, it is useful to compare it with a soccer ball and the net of a soccer goal. And as you can see in the left side, if the nodes are strong enough, the net will not only be able to adapt to the shock, but even decompose the shock in little pieces and take profit out of them. However, when we weaken these nodes, then the ball is able to break the net and the system will collapse or may collapse. And also regarding the indicators that have to be measured, sometimes we come with, because it's complex relationships and a lot of nodes in this complex network, we are not able to grasp the complexity of these relationships. And very often we simplify the indicators that we are measuring. And I have put 3 examples here, because it's really challenging when we are analyzing them. It's typical, for example, that some of the patterns observed in pastoral societies, such as these Ankole cattle of Uganda and their longhorns, are explained because the social value of these cows is known. It is just explained on a social basis, like the so-called cattle complex, and that the pastoralists are getting cows with increasingly large horns in order to impress their neighbors and to grab power. But it is disregarding the environment where these cows are living that actually needs for heat dissipation structures, such as these long horns, that are very well adapted to the major limiting factor in tropical areas, which is the heat. Another issue is, for example, land degradation. We have the example here of the land degradation of lichen-rich pastures in Scandinavia that has for a very long time exclusively linked with environmental patterns disregarding economic perspectives. And this is also an open line that we have at the University of Helsinki, where we are examining the link with fodder provision. And we know that when governments provide cheap fodder, they will artificially increase the available, the carrying capacity of the ecosystem. And this may drive to land degradation. Again, it's not only focusing on environmental patterns, but also in economic perspectives. And finally, there is a lot of talk about the economic performance of livestock vis-a-vis its climatic impact, for example, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And it is, again, disregarding an economic perspective that complements this, an environmental perspective that complements this economic perspective. For example, the rich environmental services that they provide and that may have not been taken into these productivity accounts, so that sometimes pastoralist livestock keeping is more productive in a holistic way than more intensive or industrial ways of producing livestock. And actually, we have also observed that sometimes in order to analyze these dynamics, it is useful to reconstruct the historical trajectories or the trajectories in time of pastoralist societies. Why? Because we know that some thrive, we know that others enter into crisis, we know that some collapse, and through reconstructing that pathway, we can actually identify when this area of danger, of this critical domain that gets close to collapse happens, and we can examine what intervention can help increasing resilience and not approaching to this area. And for example, we have done this exercise of comparing very different pastoral societies from northern Kenya, southern Ethiopia, from Scandinavia, and from Central Asia, but that even across different timescales repeat patterns. And it is very interesting because finally what we see is that when we see the usual dynamics of social, environmental, and economic variables that evolve a long time and that can drive a system to collapse, development programs tend to intervene in only one variable. For example, in this case, the economic variable is tackled, and while we get a slight improvement, the overall system is still very close to the area, the critical domain that can, in some variation of the system, it can drive the whole system to collapse. We are witnessing an example where the net can break easily because the nodes have been weakened. However, if we design the interventions in the same system in another way and we regard it holistically, not only intervening in the economic domain, but also in the ecological, environmental, and the social domain, we can see how we can avoid this danger area, let's say, and the net can be spared from breaking. This has a direct relationship with the penalty cycle of Holling and Gunderson that Jennifer was also talking about. So the biggest challenge for finding adequate indicators is actually reconstructing these trajectories in time, because we may find very different indicators in prehistory, in history, and in present, and we have to find comparable indicators, for example, nutrition indicators nowadays, or osteological indicators for subfossil records of rural societies 6,000–7,000 years ago that allow us to compare the status of populations. And very importantly, and this is a very key element, a participatory process can help gather better indicators, but can also increase the transferability to society, including its use in advocacy. Okay, I would like to thank the International Union for Biological Sciences and also the Helsinki Institute for Sustainability Science for this research.
Thank you very much indeed, Pablo. I really appreciate your talk and your broad view about resilience and your emphasis on indicators. It's very important what you said, and I'm looking to see more results later. So now it's the time I would like to invite our third speaker, Ilse Kuhler-Heyer. She is a project coordinator of the League of Pastoral Peoples and the International Advocacy Organization for Pastoralists, and has been based in India for the last 30 years. Namaste, dear Ilse, and now over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you see the screen? Can you see it?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever the case will be. Thank you very much for having me here and asking me to talk about agropastoralism and resilience. And since my experience largely relates to India, I will use all of India as a kind of a case study here. As it happens, India is actually a collage of pastoralist cultures, mostly agropastoralists, which is kind of a totally different perspective than how it is normally viewed, which is as a country of farmers and village republics. But we do find pastoralists all over the country, starting with yak herders in the extreme north. Then we have sheep, goat, and buffalo herders who migrate up and down between the Himalayan foothills and alpine pastures. We have cattle, camel, and sheep and goat pastorals in the far west, and we have pig pastorals in the east. We have mostly shepherds in the middle of the country on the Deccan Plateau, and we have duck, sheep, goat, cattle, and buffalo pastorals in the far south. It's not moving. Hello? Yeah, sorry.
No, it's okay.
Yeah. So what is actually agropastoralism? It is often understood as people doing some cultivation, but also moving around with herds. However, in India, most of the pastoralists actually own absolutely no land. In fact, according to the National Sample Survey, only 1% of agricultural land is used for raising livestock. What we have instead are farmers on one hand who own the land, and the pastoralists who move around with their animals, and they're extremely well integrated. The pastoralists depend on access to the fields for their grazing, and the farmers depend on the pastoralists for providing manure to them. And on this picture, you can see a pastoralist kind of fencing in his sheep for the night, and he's being paid by the farmer for per head of sheep and per night that he is spending on that field. And it's actually very frequent in India that pastoralists, their main source of income is not from selling products, but it's from selling manure. So it's extremely important. And this is an amazingly effective system that requires no fossil fuels and cuts out chemical fertilizer, thereby significantly reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. And it's really amazingly efficient, the system. India is very densely populated and has a comparatively small land mass, only about a third of China. At the same time, it's the world's largest exporter of sheep and goat meat. It's the largest exporter of beef, basically meaning buffalo meat, and it's also the largest milk producers. And it's estimated that more than 70% of its meat and more than 50% of its milk is produced on common pool resources in these kind of traditional systems. So agro-pastoralists in India, they utilized a mosaic of grazing resources, including crop aftermath, natural vegetations, tree loppings. They basically generate a second crop out of a field by also fertilizing it. They also provide de-weeding and germination services. They utilize any kind of biomass, and they're actually often silvi-agro-pastoral systems. And you can see this photo here. This field is actually covered in thistles, which the farmers hate and which the camels are converting into very tasty milk. You can see the tree there in the background, and it's an acacia tree, and the camels are actually spreading the seeds of these trees, and they are thereby supporting germination and the dispersal of trees. So it's a really fantastic system. And as Pablo already mentioned, agro-pastoralism depends on complex and wide-ranging relations with many people within the community to prevent conflict over resources with landowners and farmers, with local communities, and also with traders. The traders actually follow, in many cases, the traders follow the pastoralists to buy the live sheep because there's so much demand for meat. And the resilience of these agro-pastoral systems, it depends on pathway diversity, which is inherent in the fact, first in the mobility. Pastures can move wherever rain falls or where new areas open up. Even irrigated areas can be of benefit for pastoralists because then they can graze on the crop aftermath. It's also inherent in the ability of animals to adapt their metabolic rate. They can eat very little or they can eat in excess if a lot of vegetation is available. Thirdly, the herders have the ability to influence the gene pool on the spot. They're not dependent on breeding companies to supply them with animals, but they can change. For instance, the herders have been very successful in changing their sheep genetic resources from earlier producing wool and now producing for the meat market. They've done it all themselves, and it has happened very quickly. Fourthly, pastoralists also have the ability to contract or to disperse. They can form like big herding groups, or if there's little vegetation available, they can split up. And we've also observed there's an enormous ability to absorb labor during economic shocks, which we've seen now during the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of young men from pastor's communities who had been working in the cities have come back and they have started their own herds. So this is an extremely resilient system. And the strength of it is that it's not dependent on imported feed or on large processing facilities. It's basically autonomous. And it also has a very high protein efficiency because it creates protein out of garbage, basically, out of what nobody else wants. If we now look at the resilience of these systems, we can say that they're very well adapted to dealing with natural shocks, with droughts, extreme weather, even with disease vector, and they can cope well due to their social networks, due to their traditional knowledge, and due to their well-adapted animals. However, the major problems for them or the major shocks are actually human-made. If pastors have to are told to sedentarize if the crop changes, for instance, to BT cotton, if the forest is enclosed, if roads are built. All these are really difficult situations for them to cope with. So agropastoralists are largely powerless with respect to human-made shocks and interferences. However, we all know we're in the Anthropocene, the climate is changing, and again, our agropastoralists are very well positioned to withstand the change in climate. The problem is, so why, if these systems are so beneficial to India, really, why are there so many human-made shocks and no support systems for them? So I'm thinking that it's basically that mental map we have of India, that it's a land of farmers and nomads, and if they exist, the nomads, they're unproductive, inefficient, and backward. Then there's that thinking that output per sheep is low, growth rates do not compare with those in Western countries. That's the prevailing thinking. So there's a lack of recognition of value of agropastoralism. The fact that it provides organic manure, supports biodiversity, requires no fossil fuels, is entirely solar powered, is animal welfare friendly, and can deal with climate shocks. These aspects of agropastoralism do not enter into the equation. And in my opinion, it's this conventional efficiency thinking that does not capture the benefits of agropastoralism, which is the problem. So I started to think about the trade-offs between efficiency and resilience. And I'm wondering, can they be compared, or are they apples and oranges? So efficiency is measured by output versus input, and typically the amount of feed versus body weight or milk yield. And it's basically a rather one-dimensional or reductive parameter. It's based on uniformity and stability, and can basically only be applied to controlled systems in which humans have created artificial environment, as the possibility of shocks is not considered in the efficiency model. Resilience, on the other hand, I was thinking one should measure it by the continuity of output. However, that's to be discussed. It definitely has a temporal dimension. It needs to be measured over time. But variability and shocks are integral to the equation. And in present days, it's much more realistic in our unstable scenario with climate change and fluctuating weather patterns. Makes much more sense to look at resilience. So the fact that efficiency, the output and yield per animal is the mantra of livestock development, and by which livestock is judged, prevents us from getting the whole picture. And if we want to get a real life picture, we need to figure in the ability of livestock systems to withstand both short-term and long-term shocks, as well as positive and negative externalities. So my conclusion, tentative conclusion, is that we need to re-evaluate our approach of taking an individual animal's performance under controlled conditions as yardstick for gauging the value of a livestock production system. This is kind of a portrait approach. If we want to achieve livestock system sustainability, resilience, and also acceptability among the general public, we need to expand the prevailing criteria of efficiency, productivity by other criteria for evaluating and judging the worth and value of livestock systems. The solution would be a kind of a landscape approach that seeks to optimally deploy livestock to utilize the variable biomass of a given area with a minimum of external inputs, including fossil fuels, antibiotics, etc., and a maximum of positive side effects. I think I've erred a little bit away from the resilience topic, going into efficiency, but this is where my thinking led me, and I hope you will forgive me, and maybe there's some interesting ideas coming out of it. So if you want more information, there's my email address, our organizational address, pastoralpapers.org, and I also have my own little website and blog. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Yuzi. Thank you very much indeed for shedding light on the importance of the whole picture approach to analyze livestock. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. So before I invite the next speaker, I'd like to encourage people to send some questions, because those questions will be very important for the debate later on. So I really appreciate if you can help us to organize the debate later. Thank you. So I'd like to invite our first speaker, Antonio Solarte. He's a researcher in CIPAV, Colombia, on Ecosystem Service Working Group. He's currently working on research and rural development projects, developing sustainable agriculture and livestock production systems. So Antonio, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you.
Roger, are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Right now?
Please
Okay.
put in an overview mode. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, it's okay. So I'm going to talk about the resilience in silvopastoral systems. I'm based in Colombia, so my perspective is most from Latin America and from Colombia. It is moving. Okay. I'm lucky because the concept of socio-ecological system and sustainability and ecological resilience was explained very well at the beginning. So, but we need to take in mind that sustainability is the ability of a system to maintain results in the long term. Resilience is the capacity to tolerate external pressure or impacts while maintaining its functions, processes. Let me see here. Okay, I just was turning off. And to think about agricultural systems and resilience, we need to think in terms of socio-ecological system, where we have a part that is the ecological system and then the social system. And there are a lot of interaction between these two systems to get different results. And it works at different levels. It can be seen at a local level, regional level, national level, or global level. And the resilience in each level can be evaluated in different manners with different indicators. And we need to have this relationship between the nature and the social communities in mind when we analyze the resilience in different agricultural systems. I wanted to point out this issue of the changes in the land use to have a productive systems. In many cases, livestock production is associated with deforestation, and in the way that we make our livestock productive system is very important, because the results in terms of ecosystem services will be different. In this case, we are looking at how the forest is transformed using fire and with illegal logging to pasture, and that sometimes the weight goes to the degradation of soils and pasture and very low provision of environmental services. So it is important to have in mind, because sometimes the deforestation is a very big problem associated with the livestock production, and it has to be with the resilience system. So using this approach from FOLIC, when we have a natural system, ecosystems, we have ecosystem services for regulation, for conservation of biodiversity in good manner. But when we have intensive croplands or intensive system, we have ecosystem services related with crop productions in a big amount, but we have less extent the provision of other environmental services like preserving habitats, biodiversity, or water flow, or climate regulation. But we can manage the way that we organize our productive systems. And sometimes the system like agroforestry system, silvopastoral system, can improve the provision of different ecosystem services like preserving habitat, forests, crop production, to have a more balanced provision of different ecosystem services. And it has to do a lot with the resilience, because if we have enough environmental services from different types in our farm or in our land or in our community, we are going to have a more sustainable and also a more resilient systems. The approach that we try to follow in CPAP to develop resilient systems for livestock, we try to work at farm and also to landscape levels to combine these two levels of work. First, to identify that the biodiversity and ecosystem services is a very important part of the livestock system that should be preserved in the better way possible. And then that also that we need to do some ecological restoration in some areas that had been degraded in the production of different products. And then we try to do sustainable intensification in the areas that allow it, and to get a combination of these different interventions in the farm and a landscape level to allow the system to be more resilient. So the acknowledge and the dialogue with the technicians and the farmers is very important to build up these models, these productive models. And we need to have also that the family and the community welfare is the main focus of all the production system. And in this way, we also can contribute to do systems that are adapted to the climate change and different impacts. We understand that agro-silvopastoral system and silvopastoral system are integrated management of agricultural, forestry, and livestock components in an area to improve the productivity system and the well-being of the family. In this case, in these examples, we have cassava, plantains, bananas, pasture, and cattle, and some multi-purpose trees in the same area. And in this case, these farmers, for instance, include food security between the paddocks in strips called agro-silvopastoral strips, as an example of how to integrate food security in this livestock productive system. We try to use the ecological intensification as a means to use intensive and intelligent manner the functions and the nature of the ecosystem to produce food, fiber, energy, and environmental services from different levels. Silvopastoral systems have different characteristics that help us to produce or to develop a livestock resilient system. For instance, they can preserve biodiversity and connectivity in the productive landscape. Also, they maintain in good characteristics of the soil, of the water, to capture carbon dioxide in the biomass of trees and shrubs, and also to produce lower emissions of and contribute to the adaptation of the climate change to the livestock farming, to contribute to the better nutrition and welfare for the animals, to get a diversified system that produce food timber, fodder, and non-timber forest products to generate employment opportunities and to reduce features of the livestock possibilities. And also one characteristics of these different components of types of silvopastoral system is that we can use them at a landscape scale, combining them in different forms. For instance, we can work with the restoration of forests. We can protect also wetlands and water source of and different streams. We can use agro-silvopastoral strips, or to use the natural regeneration as a way to produce silvopastoral systems. We can have fodder banks in some areas, improve pasture with grasses and legumes, and use the strip of different multipurpose trees to divide the paddocks. In this context, all of this works in at the landscape level, and is a way to get a more resilient system. And then we have some principles that we use when we think about our productive systems. One is to preserve and restore the natural capital and biodiversity at farm and landscape level, and also to produce biomass through the use of solar energy using tropical crops like grasses, plantain, cassava, crops that are well adapted to the climate, and to integrate crops and animals as a way to produce fertilizer at farm scale, recycle the residues as fertilizer of biogas in this case, the use of low-cost material for buildings and constructions, and which is very important to promote and maintain the local organizations and families and communities working together to get the results. So I pointed out some key messages that I right here from my presentation. The first one is that livestock system should be analyzed as and we need to have in consideration this interaction between society and nature at various scales. Change in land use can generate also change in ecosystem services, but in the way that we plan our productive system, we can design them to enhance resilience. To develop resilient livestock systems, conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem services, restoration of degraded areas, and sustainable intensification must be considered as part of the system. Silvopastoral system offers environmental, productive, economic, and social advantages in the development of the resilient livestock system. And then there are some agroecological systems that can contribute to the development of resilient livestock systems. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Muchas gracias, Antonio, for presenting us the silvopastoral system as one approach to achieve resilience in the livestock sector. Thank you very much indeed. So now I'd like to invite our fifth speaker, Rory Petter, Executive Director of the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. Rory is a Scot with a background in animal production and commercial farming and ranch. It's our pleasure to receive you here, Rory. Over to you.
Thank you, Rogerio.
Pleasure.
I'll just start my timer so I remain on time. It's been interesting to see the presentations, and I appreciate the fact that people have talked about environmental resilience. I'm probably going to have a slightly different emphasis. I'm coming more from a supply chain perspective. My organization deals with the whole supply chain, and that's why that's what I'm going to talk about. We've already heard about the difference or at least the potential overlap, but the fact that sustainability and resilience are not mutually exclusive, but they're also not the same thing. So I don't need to dwell on that slide. Obviously, last year represented, and continuing into this year, a huge disturbance for supply chains. But I think while the focus is often on COVID-19, we should remember that African swine fever was, in fact, probably a bigger impact on meat supply chains and the food system than COVID-19 was. And in fact, COVID-19 might have moderated some of the more extreme effects that African swine fever had on supply chains. Because meat can replace, different species meat can replace each other. The swine fever epidemic in China, and which spread, elsewhere into Europe and so on, really had a massive impact on supply and demand for meat in the food system as a whole. And that's why I find it quite hard to talk only about beef, because we're talking about beef in this case, both beef, chicken, and other products replacing pork in China. As you can see there, the decline in pork production in China at 28 million tons was greater than the total production of pork in the EU. So it was a massive impact. Right, so then in the COVID pandemic, we saw some perturbations of the supply chain, especially where we had processing plants where there were outbreaks, they had to close, where you had to reorganize things so that people weren't working so close to each other. You had to put in protection, etc. And that exposed the lack of flexibility in our system, and it also exposed the fact that our processing capacity was, if you like, just right, but there was no spare capacity when you had problems. Other issues that we saw impacting on the supply chain were this retail channel shifting, because people weren't able to go out to food service, to restaurants, etc. So supermarkets were taking a lot of the meat that would have otherwise gone into food service. And we saw an increase in online sales of meat, which is an interesting development. That's also something that's been going on in China for longer, but it's now, this past year has really seen an increase of that in general, also in Europe and the United States, other developed and higher income countries, but not just higher income countries. As I said, this is already quite well known in China. And of course, the final piece of this is the logistical and export disruptions and freight costs really had a big impact on the amount of meat that was being traded and the way it was getting to market. So to talk about the actors that it affected, the consumer, their concerns are going to depend upon where they are in the income chain, I guess. If you're really at the bottom level in terms of income, you're not going to have much to worry about other than purely the safety. Then it's going to be price, then it's going to be the nutritional quality. And only for the really relatively wealthy consumers does the ecological modernization and the ability of a supply chain to be meeting your sort of ethical needs becomes relevant. So of the things that we saw in 2020 coming as a result of both swine fever and COVID, we think that consumers' interest in local and transparent supply chains is going to remain. We think that direct-to-consumer supply chains are also going to be increasingly important. But I think the overarching one, and the one that's important to this discussion, is the fact that building trust and both sustainability and resilience are things that people are going to look for. And maybe that is going to start in wealthy countries, but it's not only in wealthy countries. We also have seen that in China as well, where people are really getting concerned about the source of food and the fact that the system needs to be resilient, because nothing can put a country out quicker than having a shortage in the availability of core parts of the food supply. And China, this African swine fever and the sudden huge drop in pork supply really showed the dependence of China on meat supplies from other countries. So in terms of longer term impacts of COVID, I guess the economic downturn is obvious. And in terms of swine fever, that pig herd in China is going to take at least another 5 years to recover. And so that is going to mean that other meats are going to have to fill that gap. Most likely chicken will take up most of the slack, but for sure, a rising tide has lifted all boats. The beef industry, certainly Latin American beef, has benefited from that to some extent. Plant protein manufacturers are also, of course, very keen to tell us that we've reached peak meat, and they are increasing their investment, their quality, and they're trying to reduce the price. They're being very aggressive against the meat industry in general, and both painting their product as a solution to environmental problems and painting meat as the main demon. But there is obviously impetus for transformation. The pandemic did raise concern about zoonoses and intensive production systems, but probably a much longer term thing, which was going on certainly in the years leading up to 2020. We heard a lot about climate change and the impact of meat production systems on that. 2021, it's going to come back. In 2020, we had a bit of a respite from that in the mainstream media, but in 2021, it's definitely back with a vengeance. The UN Food System Summit is drawing a lot of attention to that. COP will too. So that is going to become a big issue for us this year. I think before 2020, supply chains tended to focus on actions such as good agricultural practices, improving technology and efficiency, like Ilse was talking about. But there is now a growing recognition, and I think thanks to those twin epidemics or pandemics of swine fever and COVID, that resilience and stronger ecological modernizations of the meat supply chains are required, including sort of impacts on the input and non-market services of the meat industries. So, I mean, that climate change concern and the UN Food System Summit, all of those things are really pushing policy towards some kind of carbon cost, I guess, in one way or another. We in the beef industry recognize that there's huge potential to reduce emissions, and we will benefit if we are proactive. There are various international organizations which want to target demand, suggesting that taxes on emissions would be one way of tackling meat demand. That would obviously impact on beef models, and therefore, in one way or another, in responding to this issue of climate change, we are going to see some transformation in the beef industry. I think that the industry has shown itself to be quite capable of transformation over time. Of course, there are lots of conservative elements there to deal with, but in general, we will be able to move in that direction. GRSB, my organization, is setting goals around climate. Australia, New Zealand, and Canada have already got national level goals, and I think we'll see this. Sorry about that, that's my alarm. So I should be finishing now. I'll move on to the last slide. So the lessons from all of this uncertainty were the exposure of the weaknesses in specialization and just focusing it purely on efficiency in the way that Ilse was talking about. we saw some changes in consumer behavior, the increasing importance of trust and transparency. And I think that's going to provide more momentum for sustainability and further, I think, move towards payment for environmental services and resilience will definitely increase. But all of this is still within the picture of the great food transformation and all of the other pressures which are taking place, not only around climate, but also around biodiversity. So thank you. That is my time up.
Thank you very much, Rory, to demonstrate that the great food transformation is already initiated. And hopefully we will use the lessons learned from 2020 to improve efficiency and the specialization models. I think that will be a very good challenge for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I would like to invite our last but not the least speaker. Brian Lindsay is the director of the Dairy Sustainability Framework, DSF, the Monitoring and Restoring Initiative for the global dairy sector sustainability performance. It's our pleasure to receive you. The floor is yours, Brian.
Thank you, Rogerio. Hopefully you can hear me and see my screen.
Yes, perfect.
Great. Okay, well, thanks so much to GASL for giving us the opportunity to come and talk together today, for providing the leadership, but more importantly, bringing all livestock species together. That's such a wonderful platform that isn't reflected anywhere else. And it's great that we can learn from colleagues, whether they're in India or Africa or Asia or Europe. And to you, Rogerio, thank you for giving me the opportunity to start thinking about resilience. And a lot of what I'll talk about today is a very personal thought process that I went through, looking at how resilience in the dairy sector may look like. And I think what I'm going to do, listening to all the other speakers and looking at what I've prepared here, is take more of a practical approach from a farm production perspective, taking on the academic work that's been shared already, and how do we actually apply that, thinking through farmers' brain, so to speak. So yes, I'm with the Dairy Sustainability Framework. I'm also the sector lead for Dairy for Global Dairy Platform. The Dairy Sustainability Framework is a pre-competitive and collaborative framework that brings the dairy sector together to monitor, as Rogerio said, and report the sustainability progress of the dairy sector. Currently, the DSF accounts for 27% of global milk production. So that's 27% of global milk production reporting their sustainability progress through the DSF. And that equates to about 46% of the formal milk market globally. And we recognize we have such a diverse dairy sector, even within countries, that we need to find resilience models that allow farmers and supply chains to adapt to those. The DSF works through 11 sustainability criteria. We've heard several times today the mention of environment, the economic and the social aspects. It covers all three pillars, and it drives the dairy sector in a common way or an aligned way to continuously improve their sustainability performance. Now, this has been going on for many years, but where the DSF is slightly different is that we're now quantifying the impact. We've got measures in place that allow us to build reports and share the reports of the global dairy sector. That's the 2018 on the left, and 2019. We're able to demonstrate globally how dairy is acting responsibly and trying to improve. And it's important if we're not, we find out if we're not improving as well, because as a sector, we can then work together to try and solve the challenges. But all this work on the members reporting, all this data in there is members reporting. We're able to undertake other work through Global Dairy Platform. We published this report last year, and it's climate change and the global dairy cattle sector, done through GASL and the Food and Agriculture Organization. And instead of a snapshot in time, we asked them to look at dairy's performance over a 10-year period, 2005 to 2015. And just as a snapshot, 30% increase in milk production over that 10 years period. Our absolute emissions went up by 18%, but the report actually said that would have been closer to 36% had the dairy sector not been active and proactive in putting in place roles and activities to reduce those emissions. But the most important one for me really was this 11% reduction in emissions intensity globally. Every dairy production region in the world reduced its emission intensity. That's exciting. We can't stop there. We've got more to do. And this is part of the resilience story that we need to work with. So what is resilience in dairy? And I've just done a bit of a brainstorm here. Hopefully it stimulates some discussion with you. For many farmers, it'll be about the economics. But we've got to recognize we're using natural resources. We're working in collaboration with natural resources. We have a very important social aspect we need to consider, whether that be the employees or the family on the farm. Majority of farms in the world are family farms, or the communities in which the dairy farm is functioning. And what we're trying to do is leave the business in better shape for the future, for future generations. As somebody said earlier, you know, on an earlier presentation, it's about borrowing it from the future generations. We're not inheriting it from our predecessors. And like so many of the academics said today, it's about forward thinking to allow us to manage short-term shocks, but we still want that long-term viability. And then each farm, how do we build that appropriate business model that allows us to have that resilience in the production system? So I then did a slide about the M and the H word. I don't know, you can have a second to think about what they are, but the M is multifactorial, because we've got to recognize, like all livestock production systems, we're biological systems. They don't change overnight. You cannot just flick a switch and it changes. We're reliant on animals. We've got to manage animals. We're dependent on individuals with a range of skills and abilities. We've got 133 million dairy farmers globally. Everyone has a different system they're working in, different ability, different education level, and it's diverse. We are working in partnership with nature, and that's a critical thing we've got to get better at. But we've also got to think about the quality of life for the animals we're working with, the farmer and their staff. But more importantly, that what a lot of those who challenge the livestock sector, they don't think about is a dairy business or a livestock business needs to be profitable, to reinvest, to make it better for the future. Then the H word is holistic, where we are food businesses. And many farmers don't realize that. They forget about a product when it leaves the gate or goes to market, in whatever form that is, where they're a critical part of a food supply chain. Food processors, if they don't have a sustainable supply of raw materials, they don't have a business. Though the farmer is focused on the farm and making decisions about the farm, as Rory alluded to, there's a much wider and more demanding operating environment, whether that's political, economic, social, whatever. There is real interaction between, we've got to understand the interaction between animals produced for food and consumers. And this is coming up the list a lot more. Consumers making judgments on whether they want to consume animal-based products or not, based on whatever evidence they get and where do they get that evidence. And then we've got to think about our complementarity with other food systems. How can we interact with others? We heard earlier about monocultures and things like that, but actually, what are we trying to do? How are we trying to achieve, and what's the best way to do that? Because every farm is different. Each farm has its own unique challenges. I know my neighbor, who I can see his wall over there, his property is very different to my property. We have the same goals in life, but we manage these in very, very different ways. And as Shirley said right at the beginning, interactions and trade-offs are considerable. And that's part of the challenge we have in building resilience into our systems. We've got to recognize and understand the trade-offs and make sure we make informed decisions based on that. So it's about the information you use to make that decision. So spreading the risk in line with latest knowledge. And I suppose my thinking here is back to Jennifer's comment about the insurance level. And I think this is what I was getting at here. It's about, and that's not risk coming out the back of that tanker. That's about, that's money. That's the fertilizer. So let's just have a look at this. So we need to fully appreciate the whole business. We got to look at it, as Jennifer said, as a system and break it down into subsystems and see how they interact. Then we've got to think about what's in the farmer's control. A lot of farmers worry about things that they cannot have control over, where there's many things they can do within their control. In the UK, there's at about 11 pence per litre difference between the top farmers and the bottom farmers in terms of their income. There's things within the farmer's control they can do. And then, as was said by previous speakers, what are the short, medium and long-term objectives for the business? Where do you want to be? But then what risks am I prepared to take? And how might those be mitigated? You can still take risks, but you need to think about how they might be mitigated. So what's the plan to get there? How many farmers do you know have a plan to get to an objective, long or medium term objective? I used to fund research here in the UK, and I used to bring farmers into a room and ask them to think years ahead. let's invest for your future. They were really challenged to think about anything beyond the issues they had while milking the cows that morning. It was a real challenge. They're so close to the system. So we've got to get our intelligence from a wide range of resources. Flexibility is key. What used to happen in the UK was farmers farm by date. We made hay on this date. We turned the cows out from the sheds after winter on this date. That doesn't happen anymore because of climate change and the changing seasons. We've got to be more flexible. And if you turn your cows out, many farmers would think, oh, I can't bring them back in if the weather's not good. You've got to be flexible to be able to do this. So how do you build that into the plan? And the most important one is Peter Drucker, who made that term, you can't manage what you don't measure. People in previous speakers have talked about KPIs, measures. How do we know if it's working, or how do we know if it's not working? Measures, KPIs, targets need to be measured. And here again, talking about this spreading risk, these tankers are not allowed in the UK anymore from a climate perspective, but actually it's done us a good favor by using injectors or trailing shoes now, because there's less greenhouse gas emissions in terms of implementing technology, but also I can get the cows back on the pasture so much quicker than if I was spraying it out the back of a tanker. So it's not all bad news. There's real benefits in terms of the way we operate our businesses. So we've got to recognize also that dairy is in a market, and dairy is very versatile. Farmers need to know what they're producing and what market they're producing for, and taper their produce for that. Dairy is quite unique. It has daily contact, or almost every other day contact with their customer. Unlike Rory, who just spoke, where some of his members might only see their customer twice a year. Dairy can build that relationship that's so important with their customer to make sure they maximize their opportunity to generate income. The use of genetics to generate or breed the animals that serve the market you're serving. Diet management, you can almost get an immediate impact in dairy cows, whereas beef, it might take longer, for example. Health and welfare, so critical to making a success of your business. GDP published a report last year with the Global Research Alliance on Greenhouse Gas from Agriculture, showing that proactive work on health and welfare of your animals is good for climate, but also good economically. There's real benefits there. But also, you're operating in a geographical challenging area maybe, you've got environmental challenges, nature symbiosis. How do you manage your animals? So for my sheep, can I rotate them in their pastures every 3 weeks so I use less anthelmintic to treat the worms in their gut? Can I manage those worms naturally? They're the types of things we can use, be able to apply nature for, to be able to help us build a more resilient system. And technology adoption is a classic one. Many out there think technology use in livestock management is about exploiting animals, whereas actually it helps us manage them more effectively. And an example here would be sex semen. Sex semen, which is growing substantially now, helps you have less followers on the farm. You're breeding, you know you're going to get so many females. You don't have to put so many to the dairy bull. You can use beef bulls and generate income from other sources. So technology adoption in the right way can really ensure resilience of the system. Relationships throughout the supply chain with your peers, but also with your staff. So important. This business relies on good people working with animals. And what does the farmer or the next generation like doing? Because how many businesses do you know that require the person running it to look after genetics, crops, feeding, animal health management, marketing, machinery, biodiversity, soil, water, air, infrastructure? Do what you like doing, and then get advice and get support in the things you don't like doing, because that'll help you make the right business structural decisions and related investment decisions. So is milk the only option for a dairy farmer? What are your options to build your resilient? Heifer sales, heifer rearing, meat production. You know, with more heifers available or less heifers available, you can then put more of your dairy cows for meat production. Partnerships with other farmers, maybe more common in other parts of the world, but in the UK, it's still evolving. Can another farmer grow your forage for you? Can you provide him with manure? Can you have a symbiotic relationship? What's the best use for your land, really? Does size really matter? And this is a big one. And, you know, is it yield or is it cow numbers? I've seen a lot of farmers who have increased their herd size for the sheer pleasure of cleaning up after them and milking them at no extra profit. How do you measure your resilience? Can assets be better utilized? solar panels on your roofs of your sheds if you've got them. But then always consider, what are the wider impacts and benefits of the decisions you're going to make? So Rogerio, in finishing, I really just want to say, to me, it's about getting the balance right. I don't know any farmer who would say they've definitely got it right, but that's what we're all striving for from a very practical reason of applying the knowledge we're able to use. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian. I was really excited to see your presentation and your energy to talk about something that you love. And I know that people here in the audience, they love as well the dairy sector. And just one comment, and I'm very glad to see the way that you demonstrated how resilience could be achieved in dairy sector by the correct balance of variables. Thank you very much for that. So, as you might be curious to know the results of our poll question, I kindly would like to ask Lavinia to present it, please. So, most of the stakeholders belong to the private sector, to the academic research, second by non-governmental organization, and the third, the private sector. Thank you very much to answer that. And regarding to the second question, we have like 27% and 24% for profitability and income stability, especially at the farmer level. But also, we are really appreciating the long-term ecological sustainability. That is the most important outcome of the livestock sector, for which resilience could be evaluated. Thank you very much indeed for people to answer that. Thank you all of this wonderful presentation, and it's the time for questions and also discussion. So my first question is for Jenny. Jenny, please. Second, please. Jenny, I have a question for you from Mark Mitchell. Jenny, are you tracking USAID's approach to resilience? The guidance for assessment resilience in the market system issued in September 2019. What are your thoughts on this approach in application of ASF value-added products? Please, the floor is yours again. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. I have been keeping an eye on suggested kind of resilience assessment measures across multiple different sectors for many years. And I'm actually thrilled to see this most recent one from USAID. It really embeds a lot of the resilience principles from the social ecological resilience literature, but it also embeds issues to do with power and equity. And they have some really great graphics. They still are kind of a lot, so in the past, and I'm going to say this carefully, in the past I have been a little critical because I think that there was a lot of need for quantifiable metrics, which often reduces some of the complexity in systems thinking and honestly doesn't tell you a lot about resilience. It tells you a lot about components of resilient systems. And I would have said historically, it's much easier to assess adaptive capacity than it is think about things from the more complex perspective for resilience. So I think they've done a great job in bringing it into more of a resilience framing. The one critique I had, and this is for any type of product or market really, is that the indicators they suggest understandably are still very much market focused and kind of socioeconomic. And there isn't that link to environment or the broader kind of social ecological systems that markets exist within. So, and especially given all the questions we've seen today about the focus from the poll on the importance of environmental sustainability, I think remembering the context we're in for our markets and our products is important. And that would be the kind of the next step I would like to see integrated into their approach. Rogerio, you're still on mute, I'm afraid.
Sorry, thank you very much. I have a question for Pablo Manzano. It's a question from our colleague Emmanuel Coste from France. Many thanks to the speaker and congratulations for your presentations. Emmanuel asked how it's possible to have measures, quantified indicators in resilience system. We have figures, scientific figures for greenhouse gas emissions, and how it's possible to balance between emissions and many services provided by the livestock sector. Pablo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rogerio, and thank you, Emmanuel, for your question. Actually, this is one of the examples I gave in my presentation, and there have been some works trying to factor in those different outcomes, let's say the positive outcomes from more biodiversity-related services, and the negative outcomes given like let's say the climatic footprint of more extensive or more pastoralist ways of practicing livestock keeping. And it's particularly Raymond Ripoll-Bosque and colleagues are the ones that have published on that. But personally, I think we also should be aware that there is some, some nuanced interpretation on how we are seeing greenhouse gas emissions, especially by grass-fed livestock, by pastoralist livestock, because we shouldn't forget that for most of the Earth's ecosystems, pastoralists have displaced wild herbivores, and wild herbivores have a very similar behavior as grazing livestock, and this is why precisely the environmental services that livestock provide are being able to be provided because it's a way of grazing that is very similar to wild herbivores. And then it is also not surprising to see that the amount of methane and greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted by grazing livestock is pretty similar. And I'm actually also currently working on something on that I hope to be able to publish soon. It's actually, the amount is very similar to what a wild herbivore would emit. So the question that we have to pose to politicians is it fair to consider this an anthropogenic impact on climate change? Because if we withdraw herbivores, domestic herbivores from grazed landscapes, then other wild herbivores will move in that may be able to emit the same methane. So I think that's more than an indicator of the resilience frameworks. I think this is a question to policymakers so that they count the anthropogenic climate change impacts in a different way.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Now I'd like to ask Ilse a question, please. It's a question from Danilo Peso, our colleague in Costa Rica, probably. How shocks, let's say, do the climate change or climate extreme events affect the relationships within pastoralism communities, knowing that there are differences in power within community members? How to manage those to increase resilience, Ilse? It's a very challenging for you.
Well, actually, I was trying to explain that the pastoralists, they are integrated with the farmers. So they have long-standing relationships, which often go back generations. And they will come back to the same farmers year after year, and they will not allow anybody to interfere with that. You know, if now there is a climatic event or if there's a drought, which are actually pretty frequent, that doesn't mean that, pastoralists can go into each other's territory. No, I mean, they don't. They don't allow that. And also, in the case I'm familiar with, everybody belongs to the same community, and there's a very strict and powerful council of elders, a panchayat, and they sort out all these problems. So I'm currently not aware of any, big fights or so happening. There can be grudges, or they are talking about this guy shouldn't go where I am, but it doesn't really lead to any big clashes as far as I know. So it's very egalitarian. We can't say that there's a big power differential between different pastoralist groups here.
Thank you very much, Yuzi. So I have a question also for Antonio from CIPAV in Colombia, from Jonathan Okran. Thank you for your excellent presentation. Integration of crops and livestock is one important production system in Africa. Can you highlight some of the challenges associated with the production systems in Latin America? It's a good question, Antonio, because the silvopastoral system has a good opportunity in different aspects, but the implementation is a hard task for us, especially in Brazil.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Okay, the normal way that we have in Latin America, the cattle ranching is, it doesn't include crops between the paddocks or the pasture lands. So, but with silvopastoral system, there is a huge opportunity to integrate food security in different types of silvopastoral alternatives. For instance, if we have the fodder banks, we can include in the fodder banks designs, including different food crops. And in our case, we have included in the strips, dividing the paddocks. But these systems works well in a family scale, a small scale, medium scale, but it's really a challenge when you try to do this in a bigger scale. Maybe you need to have plots, compact plots for food security between the paddocks or the cattle ranching areas to facilitate the labor. So I think that it needs a change of paradigm with the farmers. But as I said before, it's at a small scale and medium scale farmer is easier than at a larger scale of farmers to introduce this. But it's a huge opportunity to work in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. Yeah, it's a picture. It's not very easy. Anyway, I have a question for our friend Hori. Mr. Petri, could you explain what do you mean by ecological modernization a bit more, please?
Sure. I put a reference into the Q&A where that term is coming from. But essentially what it is these are responses that you make to negative consequences of increased specialization and intensification of livestock industry. So these are responses you make to mitigate the environmental impact. So there are two, in that reference I gave, there are two kind of models. Weak ecological modernization would be focusing on things like efficiency, technological solutions, and improving nutrient cycling. So that would be, yeah, what they term weak. And then the strong ecological modernization looks more into the whole system. So your agro biodiversity, your ecosystem services, including input services like soil fertility, water, pollination, and non-market services like climate mitigation, biodiversity, wildlife habitat, and so on. So what I'm saying is that we see a shift towards a focus on stronger ecological modernization as a result of some of the shocks we've experienced in the past couple of years.
Okay, thank you, Rory, but don't turn off. I have a other question for you, which is related to this one first. What are the views on the whole of the feed industry in provide solutions, feed materials and feed additives for organic production? Because organic production is a kind of can provide these ecological service. How the industry will play with that?
Well, I mean, like any industry, there are different streams that are going to embrace that or not. So you will have definitely seen a big increase in the level of interest in regenerative production or holistic management, however you want to call it. The proponents of that are generally also talking about a lower external input system. and they'd be strongly in favor of it. Obviously, in countries where there is a significant feedlot industry, North America, the model there is less, probably less open to organic approaches. And I believe that we will see both continue. We'll see probably an increase in regenerative grazing management approaches, but I think the feedlot industry is not going to go away unless something dramatic changes in government policy and maize support in North America.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question for Brian. Brian, how are you planning to convince farmers that the resilience is a very important process, a broad view of resilience? How you are playing for farmers? You said that we invite them, but you invite one by one, or it's a huge work that you are doing for dairy sustainable framework, please?
Yes, the model applied by the Dairy Sustainability Framework is pre-competitive, bringing people together. So one of the examples we're using at the moment is called communities of interest. So we've got a couple of communities of interest running. We're going to have one for each of the 11 criteria. And it really is members sharing information with members. So it's not about me. I provide a platform. It's about people who are having the same challenges in different parts of the world, but have different ways of solving those challenges. And it's that cross-fertilization of ideas may need some tweaking that allow that to happen. And it's the same with farmers. Farmers like learning from other farmers. I think it was on one of the presentations earlier, and I absolutely agree. We like to kick the dirt with each other. We like to know somebody else has tried it before we've done it. And that's the same happening in the DSF, in that it's someone in Peru sharing information with someone in Europe saying, you know, and someone in Europe thought they were well ahead, but actually they learned a lot and said, actually, we could do that, maybe with some tweaking. So it really is about generating that platform that provides an open mind, a willingness to share in a non-judgmental environment. And that trust and non-judgmental environment is so critical for the whole industry to move forward. I hope that answers the question, Rogerio.
So thank you very much. Now it's time to open the floor for all the speakers to talk the final remarks that they want to make, because we are against the time. So the floor is open for all of you, please, including Shirley. So is that one? Ilse, Pablo, Petre?
I can start if you want, or Ilse,
Yes.
if you want to start.
No, please.
Ladies first.
Sure.
No, I just want to add something to the answer about, you know, conflicts arising between different pastoralist groups of different power, etc. Actually, I do have to, in this case, commend the Indian government, because during droughts, they actually put a great effort into providing a fodder. They, the last big drought we had in Rajasthan, the government brought in enormous trainloads and truckloads of fodder from Punjab. So that's one thing that is there. I don't want to ignore that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Pablo, please.
As a final remark, I wanted to say that you know, when we are talking about indicators, about measuring resilience, and also about measuring what to do, I consider it extraordinarily important in what are very dynamic systems that we partially, or a lot more than we normally do, rely on the information that we get from the producers themselves, from the livestock keepers themselves, because they are aware of the situation of the ground and can provide the best indicators. But also very often they can provide the solutions, the innovative solutions. So I'm more of an advocate of facilitating education and access to decision-making by those livestock keepers, so that they have their voice and they will come up with their imagination and their knowledge on the terrain with the solutions that we need for the future.
If I can just build on that,
yes,
absolutely
please.
agree. Even though the DSF has global indicators, we require our members to have local KPIs, targets, and timelines, because there's so much more meaningful. Who am I sitting in the UK to tell them how to measure their performance? It's really taking up that local knowledge, and then they own it. And that's the key thing. We want them to own it. And because then they can't escape and say, that's someone else's farm, that's over there from a book. This is about you. And this, if we're going to get the change we need in the transforming the food system, as Rory referred to, we've got to allow these farmers to evolve, recognizing that they're all very different in very different situations. So we've got to build models that allow them to do that.
Thank you very much. Jennifer, would you like to add some points on that?
Sure. I actually think the main point I want to make is that whilst producers and the sectors as a whole are kind of facing a lot of changes at the minute, and that's why resilience is such a tempting topic to think about, I also want to remind us, as a couple of the speakers did, that change isn't always necessarily a bad thing, right? This is actually windows of opportunity to create kind of better regimes and more sustainable futures and more, you know, profitable livelihoods / sustainable, secure livelihoods. So I think it ties into kind of Pablo and Brian's points that this is why this has to be an engaged process all through these kind of systems and sectors, because the good ideas to drive the change into an opportunity space is going to need to come from diverse perspectives. And so I would just argue that, you know, yes, I can do the research side of long-term indicators, great, we need a long-term perspective, but we also need to think into the future as well. And that's actually, hopefully, an optimistic point to end on, not just a terrifying point.
Thank you very much. Rory, what do you think that you can, how can you play with the beef sectors in this matter, please?
Yeah, as I've mentioned before, so we're under a lot of pressure on, particularly around climate and biodiversity. I think those are both opportunities to take a sort of optimistic look from Jenny's book there. They are opportunities for us, and the beef industry uses a huge amount of land. There's no argument about that, and in many parts of the world that could be done better. We do provide ecosystem services. We probably need to be better about ensuring that that is taking place, but also demonstrating to the world that that is the case, and that we're actually contributing to a thriving food system rather than creating a global burden.
Thank you indeed. Thank you. Antonio, do you think that the silvopastoral system will cope with all these aspects, or it's not enough for the silvopastoral system? Mic, please, turn on.
Yeah.
Your mic is off. Great. Thank you.
Okay. I was thinking about different things that the public write in the questions. And one point is that the resilience is a very complex issue that has different perspectives and is influenced by many different things. So I received some question about the adoption, and I want to talk about the role of the market, because sometimes the people produce, but the market is demanding, and sometimes the market sends signals that promote the adoption of different things. In this case, for instance, if the market is demanding products that are produced in a environmental friendly manner, people goes in this way. So I think that from a socio-ecological perspective, this relation between production market of these communities is a very huge force that can improve these changes in the systems. We have some initiatives, small initiatives for milk and beef production in Colombia that are promoting this adoption. Of course, that are also some barriers about the knowledge of the farmers and capital that is needed to implement the system, that it can be solved through incentives of some loans and other things. But I just wanted to raise the point of the strong role of the market to improve these different type of systems in our
Thank
case,
you.
silvopastoral system.
Thank you very much. Shirley, our chair, do you want to make some final remarks for us?
Thank you, Rogerio. I actually thought Eduardo was going to do that, but that's okay. I just want to congratulate you for organizing this and to thank all the panelists and everybody who's stayed and listened, but also contributed questions and comments. I think it's been an extremely rich discussion. I would challenge you, Rogerio, what you're going to do with all of this. I think we've heard a lot about change and opportunity in these closing remarks, which perhaps does bring the pieces together rather nicely. And I was reflecting, it's not just change for change's sake, but it's change because things around us are changing. It's change because all of us need to do better in the space of sustainability and resilience and efficiency and all these things that we've actually got to figure out how they talk to each other as well. So let's make sure that we do take this forward in some way or other, so that we can, as a livestock community, be responsive in this space. I'm not sure who mentioned it along the way in one of the presentations, was just saying, let's make the best use. I think being resilient means that you're not trying to fit round pegs in square holes or square pegs in round holes, whichever one it is, but you're really using not only the environment, but your resources as a farmer, a processor, an entrepreneur, whatever, in that space to contribute to a sustainable and resilient food system. So let's see how we can take this forward. Let's keep this community connected. I see Lavinia saying that the presentations and the recording will be up on the GASL website, so people can come back there, and hopefully we can foster a way for people to keep connected on this topic. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Shirley, following your question about what I will do with all this information, it's a moment to invite all the 6 speakers to help me to draft a document that probably be published in GASL and further on. Please, you have a good task for the future. Thank you very much. I'd like to make as a final conclusion that I wrote here and I'd like to share with you. We want, on behalf of the Closed Efficiency Gap, we want to initiate the discussion about this important topic, resilience. In addition, we want to identify the main elements determining this topic. Also start exploring possible metrics, components to measure resilience. And finally, I'd like to quote Donald Moore, that in the last DSF meeting that I participate, my first one, he mentioned, to increase resilience, we do not need revolution, but we need evolution. So therefore, I hope that this seminar has initiated this process. So thank you very much indeed for all the panelists and the participants to stay with us during this almost 2 hours. And thank you very much indeed. I would like to pass now the floor for our manager, Eduardo Arcer, for the final words. And a special thanks to Lavinia. Lavinia was an incredible person to organize all this stuff. Thank you very much indeed, Lavinia. So Eduardo, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Rogerio. We are really happy about the outcome of this seminar. I would like to thank you particularly for your efforts and also all the panelists. And I really want to mention the support we're getting from our chair, Shirley Tarawali. Thank you, Shirley, for being here with us. And especially Lavinia, the consultant we have in the Secretariat of GASL, who has done a really great job organizing so many details. And to the attendees, many thanks. We had more than 100, 126, 128 at some point. And we really appreciate that you come to GASL, you know, to refresh, to participate and exchange ideas. Today I heard a few interesting complementations or complementary ideas for the concept of resilience. I had really great ideas. I heard that resilience is not only the capacity for a system to absorb shocks, but also the capacity to sustain change. That is a very enlightening idea. Great. I also heard that for pastoralists, the key is to have a diversity of pathways, to open our minds to this diversity. Then I heard that something important is the vertical and horizontal mobility of the animals. And I was impressed with this picture that Paulo showed of these animals on top of those trees. Huh? That was interesting, amazing. Also that, you know, the important for resilience is the ability for the system to maintain the results in the short term. I heard multifactorial, I heard holistic, I heard risk and knowledge coming together. So I was really, it was very rich to hear so many ideas, supply chain disturbances that actually become an opportunity now for many enterprises in the world. I also heard that we should go to an ecological modernization, be that we like it or not, because we may be having taxes for emissions, and also the importance of reporting. So many great ideas that I really feel that I am taking home a lot of interesting and also challenging ways to address this topic. So I hope that we will put together this document that Rogerio has promised. And I want to thank everybody again for your great contributions and also for these active audience that we have had today. So have a great day, night, evening, morning for all of you. And thank you again, Rogerio, for organizing this.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. And if the COVID-19 pandemic, on one hand, has brought us problem, on the other hand, led us to the great food transformation. Thank you, everybody, for your wonderful time that we have together, and I hope that you help us to build up a very good document for future. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Ciao.